They put me in the observer tier because they didn't know where else to put me. That's not a complaint. I understood the logic. I was an exchange attendee, not a cadet. 47 years old, audit clearance only, no active console, no live drill authorization, no business being in Bay 12 at all, except that the enrollment algorithm had cross-referenced my occupational history and flagged emergency systems against the drill calendar and decided I was relevant. The Velthery Continuance Academy had a process for everything. The process had produced me, sitting in the elevated observer tier above 30 cadets who were about to have a very bad simulated morning, holding a paper cup of something warm that tasted like tea, if tea had given up. Bay 12 was a sealed annex. 3 walls of active display. Every surface running live feed from the simulated site. A transit hub on a colony platform. 16,000 civilians. 1 catastrophic pressure coupling failure, cascading through 4 subdecks. The cadets sat at consoles arranged in a horseshoe below me. Their job was Continuance Protocol 7. Coordinate the evacuation, maintain exit corridor priority sequencing, get the civilian population to the designated muster points before the simulation's internal clock ran the cascade to terminal. It was, I had been told, the hardest drill in the Academy's emergency systems curriculum. 71 iterations. 11 cadet cohorts. Pass rate, 38%. Drill coordinator Esaveth Tor stood at the floor's edge, tall, articulated, the kind of still that isn't calm, so much as waiting. She had 4 arms and a thorax that moved independently of her shoulders when she breathed, and I had learned in my first week that the faint shimmer along her ventral plates meant she was processing pheromone data from the room. She didn't need instruments to read her cadets. She read the air. I was aware she couldn't read me. She had told me as much at intake. Politely, the way you tell someone their paperwork is in order while privately noting that their paperwork describes something your filing system wasn't built for. You will register as a neutral, she had said. My assessments will not include you. I told her that was fine. She had tilted her head at an angle that I'd since learned meant she was filing something away. Protocol 7 started at 0600, and it started badly, which is to say it started exactly as designed. The first display wall lit with the coupling failure. A clean structural schematic going red from the bottom left. Corridor by corridor, the cascade eating the platform's lower decks in the methodical way that real systems fail, not the dramatic way that simulations usually fake it. No explosion, no klaxon, just a pressure differential, then another, then a third, and suddenly 16,000 civilians needed to be somewhere other than where they were, and the clock was running. The cadets moved fast. I'll give them that. Console activity spiked inside 4 seconds. Hands on panels, route queries firing, civilian density mapping pulling up on the center display. They were trained. You could see the training. Corridor B7 opened as primary egress in the first 90 seconds, which was correct. Secondary routes came online in order. The muster point allocation looked right from where I was sitting. I drank my not tea and watched the lower left corner of the third display wall. The cascade kept moving. That was the thing about Protocol 7, that the pass rate told you if you knew how to read pass rates. The cadets who failed weren't failing because they didn't know the protocol. They were failing because the protocol was right and the simulation had a flaw, and the flaw was patient. By minute 4, 22 of the 30 cadets had B7 as their primary corridor. The civilian flow was moving. The numbers looked good. Esaveth Tor's ventral plates were still. She was reading the room and finding what she expected to find. Controlled stress, managed load, a cohort performing inside acceptable parameters. I set down the cup. The coupling failure had eaten through subdeck 4 and was working on 3. Standard cascade progression. The evacuation was moving 16,000 civilians through B7 and the 4 secondary corridors, and everything was correct. And in approximately 90 seconds, the simulation's internal pressure model was going to register that B7's structural load tolerance was 14,000 bodies per 12-minute window, and 22 of 30 cadets had just routed 16,000 bodies through it in 8. Not a protocol error, a geometry error. The kind that happens when you learn evacuation from models and not from sites. On a model, corridor capacity is a throughput number. On a site, it's also a weight number and a friction number and a panic compression number. And on a platform where the subdeck below the corridor is already failing, it is a very specific number that is lower than the throughput chart says it is. The display in the lower left corner was still showing the cascade. It had reached subdeck 3. B7 ran over subdeck 3. I had built evacuation systems for 11 years on 4 different colony platforms before I retired to teach, and I had learned one thing that no model teaches you, and every site does. The protocol is the last thing to kill you. The thing that kills you is the one assumption the protocol makes that nobody checked. 30 cadets. 22 with B7 primary. The clock at 7 minutes, 40 seconds. I said, at a volume that carries but doesn't shout. Your primary corridor is sitting on a failing deck. Split the flow now, or your muster numbers are wrong. 11 words. I counted afterward, the way you do when you try to remember whether you said it right. The room stopped. Not the simulation, the room. 22 heads turned. HFY turned, which was something I hadn't seen her do sharply before. It moved all 4 shoulders at once, a full body pivot that her species apparently reserved for things that interrupt their read of a situation. One of the cadets, young, pale green, the one who'd had B7 secondary instead of primary, was already moving. His hands went to his panel before the others processed what I'd said. Secondary corridor C4 open, flow split command issued, civilian routing query sent, and returned in 4 seconds. The display updated. B7 load dropped below threshold. C4 absorbed the delta. The cascade kept moving through subdeck 3, but now there was nothing above it that mattered. The simulation clock ran to 12 minutes. The internal pressure model ran its terminal check. Muster point population, 15,941. Threshold, 15,400. Continuance protocol 7, pass. First pass in 11 iterations. HFY stood very still for a moment that lasted slightly longer than her other moments. I had been around her long enough to know that the shimmer along her ventral plates had changed frequency. Not reading the room now, doing something else with the data she'd just taken in. She crossed to the observer tier. She didn't use the stairs. She had a different way up that I hadn't entirely mapped yet. She stood at the railing and looked at me with the compound focus her species uses when they want you to know they are not looking at anything else in the room. You have no console authorization, she said. No, you have no active clearance for this drill. No, you spoke from outside the designated participant boundary. I picked up the cup. It was empty. I held it anyway. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the 30 cadets were very carefully not looking at us, which meant they were listening to every word. The flaw you identified, HFY said. Is it in Protocol 7's design, or in how my cadets applied it? The design, I said. The protocol assumes corridor capacity from throughput modeling. It doesn't wait for subdeck integrity under a concurrent cascade. If the platform's failing at the same time you're evacuating it, and it usually is, that number is wrong. Has been wrong for however long this protocol has been running. She processed that. Her thorax moved. 71 iterations, she said. Yes. She turned and descended and spent the next 6 minutes running her cadets through a full debrief that I was not party to. I could see the display activity, the routing replays, the load model overlaid with the cascade progression. The one cadet who'd caught it early being asked to walk his read back from the beginning. He did well. They all did by the end. That's the thing about cadets who are actually learning. Once you show them the assumption, they can't unsee it. At 0720, she filed 2 documents. I know because she told me before I left the bay, the way you tell someone when you want the record to be clear. The first was a cohort performance review, mark pass, first successful completion in 11 iterations. The second was an amendment request to Protocol 7's design specification, citing a structural load calculation error in the corridor capacity model. The author field said, Amendment source, Exchange Observer, Bay 12, 0700. She hadn't asked my name for the form. She hadn't needed it. She knew what she'd read in the air when I'd spoken, whatever frequency I put out that her receptors had no word for, and she'd file me under that instead. I thought that was probably accurate enough.